On the night of the 12th of April, 1945, in a small house in Warm Springs, Georgia, the most powerful man in the world suddenly collapsed. Just weeks before the end of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who had led America through the darkest years of the 20th century, passed away in silence. But this is not a story about his death. This is a story about a man who should never have become a symbol of strength. Because at the age of 39, Franklin Roosevelt was struck by a devastating illness that took away his ability to walk. From an ambitious politician, he suddenly faced fear, despair, and the prospect that his career might be over forever. In an era when people believed a leader had to stand firmly on his own 2 feet, Roosevelt could not even take a step without help. So what turned a man who seemed defeated by fate into the only president in American history to be elected to 4 consecutive terms? How did he manage to lift a nation drowning in the Great Depression, give hope to millions of people who had lost their jobs, and then guide the free world through the greatest storm of war in human history? Behind the confident smile in his photographs lay secrets few people knew. Behind his inspiring speeches were quiet battles fought against illness, pressure, and the weight of the times. This is the extraordinary journey of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who proved that the greatest leaders are sometimes not the ones who never fall, but the ones who know how to rise after falls that seem impossible to overcome. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States. Chapter 1: A Child Born to Lead. To understand who Franklin Roosevelt was, we first need to understand where he was born. Not just a location on a map, a world entirely different from the one most Americans lived in at that time. On the 30th of January 1882, at the Springwood Estate in Hyde Park, New York, a baby boy was born into the Roosevelt family. This was one of the oldest and wealthiest families in America, with roots tracing back to Dutch settlers who had arrived in the region in the 17th century, back when New York was still a European colony and people still called it New Amsterdam. Over many generations, the Roosevelt family had built up land, money, and social standing until they became an inseparable part of the aristocracy of the Hudson Valley. The house where baby Franklin came into the world was no ordinary house. Springwood was a sprawling estate covering hundreds of acres, looking out over the scenic Hudson River to the west. Inside were spacious rooms paneled in dark wood, paintings hung on the walls, bookshelves reaching to the ceiling, and porcelain sets brought back from Europe. This was the world Franklin Roosevelt opened his eyes to, a world completely unlike the life most American children were living at the time, crammed into tenements in poor neighborhoods or scraping by on dry farmland in the heartland. Franklin's father was James Roosevelt, a gracious gentleman, already 53 years old when his son was born. James was not the man who had built the family fortune, but the one who had inherited it, and he lived accordingly, managing the estate, sitting on the boards of a few railroad companies, hunting, playing golf, and being a kind husband and father in the way the 19th century upper class understood kindness. He loved Franklin in his own quiet, unhurried way, taking the boy fishing on summer mornings and teaching him to observe nature. But the person who truly shaped Franklin Roosevelt was not this gentle father. It was his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Sarah Delano came from a family even more distinguished than the Roosevelts. The Delano line traced back to French Huguenots who had settled in America in the 17th century, and Sarah's father had made a vast fortune trading with China during the boom years of commerce between the two countries. Sarah was a beautiful, intelligent woman with an iron will packed into a slender, elegant frame. She married James Roosevelt at 26 and gave birth to Franklin at 28. He was her only child. And she poured the full weight of her focus, her love, her expectations, and her control as a strong-willed woman into that one child. Sarah Roosevelt loved Franklin in a way that was sometimes hard to tell apart from possession. She decided what he wore, what he ate, who he played with, what he studied, and how. Until he was 14, Franklin did not attend school like other children, but was taught at home by private tutors that Sarah herself selected. She took him to Europe again and again, had him learn French and German, and steeped him in the culture of the Western upper class exactly as she imagined it should be. Her goal was never spoken aloud, but it was always there beneath the surface. This son had to become someone extraordinary. Franklin grew into a healthy, cheerful, likable boy. He loved horseback riding, sailing on the Hudson River, and collecting postage stamps, a passion he kept for the rest of his life. He also loved birds and could identify dozens of native species just by their calls, an interest his father had sparked during their morning walks around the estate. But young Franklin's life was missing something most children take for granted: friends his own age. Because he was homeschooled, because he lived on an estate far from any neighborhood, and because his mother tightly controlled who was allowed near her son, Franklin Roosevelt grew up in a loneliness that was comfortable and materially rich, but loneliness all the same. This gave him a particular gift for entertaining himself, for observing, for thinking things through alone. It also planted in him a deep hunger to be liked and approved of by others, a hunger he would carry for the rest of his life, and one that would sometimes lead him to make decisions that puzzled the people around him. In 1896, when Franklin was 14, Sarah finally agreed to let her son attend Groton, a prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts for the children of upper-class families. This was the first time Franklin actually lived among peers his own age, in a setting where he was not the center of the universe. And he struggled. Not academically. Franklin did well in his studies, especially languages and history. His struggle was the struggle of a child used to being protected and indulged, now standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in a community that had its own rules. His classmates had already formed bonds years before he arrived. He was the outsider. And even though Franklin tried to fit in, even though he was friendly and easy to talk to, there remained a small distance between him and his schoolmates that he never fully closed during his years at Groton. The teacher who influenced Franklin the most at Groton was Headmaster Peabody, an Episcopal minister who believed that those born into fortune and privilege carried a responsibility to serve society. This was not a revolutionary or complicated idea, but for a boy who had grown up surrounded by wealth without ever really thinking about the responsibility that came with it, Peabody's message planted something important in Franklin's mind. The seed of public duty was sown here, in the morning chapel sermons at Groton, even though it would take years before it truly took root. In 1900, Franklin Roosevelt entered Harvard. He was 18, handsome, tall, with a wide smile and the confidence of someone who had never really faced a major setback in life. At Harvard, he studied history and government, but what pulled at him more than his studies was the school's social life. He wanted to join the prestigious clubs, wanted to be admired by his peers, wanted to carve out his place in the community. He became editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper, a position he won not just through writing talent, but through patience and resourcefulness in rallying friends to his side. This was the first sign of a skill that would later become his most powerful weapon in politics: the ability to read people, understand what they wanted, and find ways to bring them over to his side. But there was a shadow that hovered over Franklin Roosevelt throughout his Harvard years, a shadow that both inspired him and pressed down on him without being spoken. It was his distant uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1901 became President of the United States after President McKinley was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt was, at that time, one of the most famous men in the world. He was a war hero, an explorer, a conservationist, an author, a big game hunter, and the youngest president in American history. He lived fully in everything he did and said out loud everything he thought. To the young Harvard student Franklin Roosevelt, Uncle Theodore was not just a family member, but a role model, a guiding light, a target he wanted to reach for, even if he never admitted it out loud. Franklin visited the White House and was warmly received by his uncle. He watched Theodore work, greet visitors, make decisions. And in the mind of that 20-year-old young man, a path began to take shape, faint and unclear as it still was. Also, during his Harvard years, Franklin ran into someone he had known since childhood but had never really paid attention to. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt, daughter of his uncle Elliott Roosevelt, Theodore's younger brother. Eleanor and Franklin were distant cousins, and socially, a marriage between two people from the same distinguished family was not considered unusual at all. But Eleanor Roosevelt was not someone whose depth showed at first glance. While Franklin grew up sheltered and adored, Eleanor grew up in sorrow. Her mother died when Eleanor was 8. Her father, whom she loved deeply, was a gifted man but a severe alcoholic, and he died when she was 10. Eleanor was sent to live with her grandmother, a strict and cold woman. She grew up shy, insecure about her looks, and lonely in a way completely different from Franklin's comfortable loneliness. It was exactly that difference that drew them together. Franklin saw in Eleanor a depth and seriousness he had never found in the other young women of New York's upper class. Eleanor saw in Franklin a warmth and energy that her emotionally starved life had never offered her. They began meeting in secret because Franklin knew his mother would object, and Sarah did indeed object fiercely. She took Franklin on a summer-long trip to Europe, hoping the feelings would cool. They did not. In 1903, Franklin graduated from Harvard and proposed to Eleanor. He was 21. Sarah insisted they keep the engagement secret for a year to make sure this was not a rash decision. Both agreed. A year later, their decision had not changed. The wedding took place on the 17th of March, 1905. Theodore Roosevelt, then the sitting president, attended and walked Eleanor down the aisle in place of her late father. The guests crowded around to catch a glimpse of the president and nearly forgot about the bride and groom entirely, a detail many of those present would later recall with amusement. Franklin Roosevelt laughed. He had long grown used to standing in the shadow of his larger-than-life uncle. But in the mind of that 23-year-old young man, a thought may have quietly formed, one he never said aloud to anyone. Someday, he would no longer be the one standing off to the side. After and aside, he would be the one people crowded around just to see. The boy who grew up in Hyde Park with everything that money and lineage could give a person had stepped out into the world fully equipped materially, but lacking in many other ways. He did not yet know what failure felt like. He did not yet know what real suffering felt like. He had never once had to worry about tomorrow's meal or the next paycheck. Those lessons life would teach him in ways he never could have imagined. Chapter 2: The Road to the Top and the Unexpected Fall. After the wedding, Franklin Roosevelt enrolled at Columbia Law School in New York. He was not an outstanding student. Law did not light the fire he was still searching for. He dropped out once he had qualified to sit for the New York bar exam, then went to work for a small law firm in the city. The job was livable, decent enough, but nothing more than that. And Franklin Roosevelt knew he wanted something far more than that. He wanted politics. Not because he burned with some grand ideal from his youth, but because he was Franklin Roosevelt, cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt, raised to believe that people of his class had a duty to serve the country, and because deep down he always carried a hunger to stand at the center of things, to be listened to make a difference on a large scale. In 1910, a group of Democratic Party leaders in Dutchess County, New York, was looking for a candidate for state senator. They needed a name that sounded distinguished, a young, clean face untouched by political scandal. Someone suggested Franklin Roosevelt. He was 28, with no political experience at all, but he carried the Roosevelt name, and that name carried its own weight. There is something worth noting here. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. Franklin Roosevelt chose to run under the Democratic banner. This was not an impulsive decision, but a deliberate calculation. Franklin understood that if he joined the Republican Party, he would forever live in his famous uncle's shadow. The Democratic Party gave him his own path, his own identity in politics. He campaigned by renting a red automobile and driving it through every village in Dutchess County, stopping at every corner to shake hands and talk with people. This was 1910, when a car was still a novelty to many farmers, and the sight of a handsome young man pulling up in a bright red automobile right to their gate made a strong impression. He talked farming with farmers, trade with shopkeepers, schools with mothers. He listened more than he spoke, and he remembered. Franklin Roosevelt won the 1910 election in a year when Democrats swept the country, but his victory in a county that had voted Republican for 32 straight years was still remarkable. He entered the New York State Senate in Albany at just 29, confident, handsome, and not yet aware that he was stepping into an environment far more dangerous than anything he had known in the peaceful life of Hyde Park. Albany in 1910 was a world where money, power, and compromise intertwined in ways a young man raised on the Hyde Park estate had never encountered. The Democratic Party machine in New York was controlled by Tammany Hall, the legendary political machine of New York City, with a decades-long history that was equal parts shrewd and corrupt. Tammany Hall's leaders expected the young Senator Franklin Roosevelt to vote obediently along with their instructions, just like everyone else. They were wrong. Franklin Roosevelt joined a group of young senators fighting against Tammany Hall in a months-long battle over the election of a United States Senator. Tammany Hall wanted to install its own man in the seat. Roosevelt and his group flatly refused. In the end, both sides had to compromise on a third candidate, but Franklin Roosevelt emerged from the fight with a new reputation, a man unafraid to stand up to the powerful. The press took notice of him, and he began learning how to use that attention. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson, governor of New Jersey, won the presidential election. Franklin Roosevelt had backed Wilson early, and that support did not go unnoticed. In 1913, at 31, Franklin Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the very position his uncle Theodore Roosevelt had once held before rising to fame in the Spanish-American War of 1898. This was the leap from state politics onto the national stage, and Franklin Roosevelt made the most of every day of it. Over 7 years as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he learned how the federal machine ran from the inside. He oversaw the procurement of warships, negotiated contracts with contractors, and managed tens of thousands of civilian and military personnel. He learned how to run a massive organization, how to get Congress to approve budgets, how to build relationships with the press to shape the story in his favor. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914 and America finally entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt stood at the center of America's naval war effort. He pushed for faster shipbuilding, better weapons, and a more assertive navy. He even asked to be sent to the front lines to fight, but President Wilson refused. telling him he was more useful in Washington. During his years in Washington, Franklin Roosevelt became known for his seemingly boundless energy. He arrived at the office early, worked late, attended dinner parties, met with politicians, visited naval bases, and still found time for long dinners with the journalists and congressmen he needed to win over on one matter or another. He was charming, good-humored, always had a good story to tell, and always remembered the name of everyone he met. In a world where networks of relationships were the most important currency, Franklin Roosevelt was a rich man. Eleanor and the children were with him in Washington, but Eleanor increasingly felt herself standing on the sidelines of her husband's busy social life. She disliked the long cocktail parties and the shallow conversations of Washington's power circles. She preferred reading, preferred substantive conversations about ideas and real people. They lived under the same roof and talked less and less about anything that truly mattered between them. In 1918, Eleanor discovered a bundle of letters in her husband's suitcase while he was away. The letters were from Lucy Mercer, the woman Eleanor herself had hired 3 years earlier as the family's social secretary. Lucy was 4 years younger than Eleanor, beautiful, gentle, and clearly someone with whom Franklin Roosevelt had been carrying on a long affair. Eleanor set the letters down and made a decision. She asked for a divorce. What happened next was one of the most complicated negotiations in the history of the Roosevelt family. Sarah, once she learned of it, stepped in with all the force of a woman who controlled the entire family fortune. She made it clear to her son that if he divorced Eleanor to marry Lucy Mercer, she would cut him off financially, completely. No inheritance, no Hyde Park, no Springwood. Franklin's political advisors also warned him that a divorce would end his career in a country where the public morality of its politicians was still held to a very high standard. Franklin Roosevelt ended things with Lucy Mercer and promised Eleanor it would never happen again. The marriage did not break apart, but it changed forever. Eleanor never fully forgave him, not in the way an ordinary wife forgives. From then on, she and Franklin were political partners and intellectual allies more than husband and wife in the traditional sense. And one could argue that this very change was what transformed Eleanor Roosevelt from a woman living in her husband's shadow into one of the most important historical figures of the 20th century. In 1920, the Democratic Party chose Franklin Roosevelt as its vice presidential candidate, running alongside presidential nominee James Cox. Roosevelt was 38, full of energy and confidence. But 1920 was not a good year for Democrats. The American people were tired of President Wilson and his complicated internationalist ideals. They wanted to return to normal life after years of war and upheaval. Republican candidate Warren Harding won in a landslide with a simple promise to bring America back to normalcy. Cox and Roosevelt lost badly. Franklin Roosevelt's political career, at least for the time being, was over. He returned to New York, took a job at a financial firm, and tried to find the rhythm of an ordinary life again. He kept up his political connections, still wrote letters, and met with Democrats across the country. But the door to the White House, though not fully closed, was no longer as wide open as before. Then the summer of 1921 arrived. In August 1921, the Roosevelt family went to spend the summer at Campobello Island, a small island in the Bay of Fundy, straddling the border between the United States and Canada. It was where the family had vacationed for years, a peaceful corner of the world where Franklin could sail, swim, and briefly forget the disappointment of the previous year's election. On the 10th of August, 1921, after an afternoon of sailing and swimming in the cold waters of the Bay of Fundy, Franklin Roosevelt felt something was wrong. He was more tired than usual, his body ached, and he went to bed early, hoping he would feel better the next day. He did not feel better the next day. On the morning of August 11th, when he tried to get out of bed, his left leg would not hold his weight. He thought it was a cramp, but by afternoon, both legs were completely numb. His temperature spiked. He lay down on the bed and could not sit up on his own. A doctor was called. At first, they thought it was a severe flu, then a blood clot, then spinal damage. Only later came the accurate diagnosis: paralysis caused by the polio virus. The disease had struck directly at his spinal cord, destroying the nerves that controlled the muscles in the lower half of his body. Franklin Roosevelt was 39 years old, at the peak of physical health. Just the week before, he had been swimming and sailing in the cold bay waters. And now he lay in bed, unable to move his legs, unable to sit up on his own, unable even to use the bathroom without help. Eleanor cared for him through those first weeks with a patience and devotion that perhaps even she did not know she possessed until it was tested. She stayed up late, filled in for the nurse when needed, and more importantly, she stood between Franklin and the outside world during the months when he was not yet ready for people to know the state he was in. Sarah wanted Franklin brought back to Hyde Park to rest. In her mind, she had already sketched out a future for her paralyzed son. He would become a frail gentleman, living in the great house at Hyde Park, reading and writing, cared for attentively, withdrawn from public life. That was what a woman of the 19th century imagined when she looked at her son's condition. Franklin Roosevelt had an entirely different idea. During those months lying in bed, with the ceiling the only thing he saw for hours each day, something inside him did not break. There was pain, there was despair, there were nights spent alone in the dark. But there was one thing that did not collapse. People have called it many things: willpower, survival instinct, or simply an ego too large to accept that this was the end. His aide and close friend Louis Howe, a small, sickly, unhandsome newspaperman, but one of the sharpest minds in New York politics, sat by Franklin's bedside from the very first days. Howe believed in Franklin Roosevelt with the absolute loyalty of a man who believes in a rising star. He told Franklin that his political career was not over, that there was a way back, that legs that could no longer run did not mean everything was lost. Eleanor listened to those conversations, and she chose to stand with Louis Howe rather than with Sarah. The years that followed were years the outside world never saw, yet they were the most important years of Franklin Roosevelt's life. He did physical therapy every day with the persistence of a man who refused to accept limits. He learned to move on crutches, using the strength of his arms to bear his entire body weight in steps that were each a quiet battle of their own. He learned to lift himself in and out of a wheelchair with an expression as relaxed as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, so the person across from him would never feel awkward. And while his body fought to survive, his mind was learning something that 39 years of a fortunate life had never taught him. He learned patience. When he could not stand up and walk, he had to sit still and wait. He learned to depend on others without feeling ashamed. He learned to see the world from the height of someone sitting down while others stood around him. And for the first time in his life, a man born with everything began to truly understand what it meant to lose, what it meant to fight for something others took for granted. Franklin Roosevelt's legs would never work again. That was the truth he eventually had to accept. But something else in him was healing, and it healed in a way far stronger than anything he had possessed before the disease found him. Years later, when someone asked Eleanor Roosevelt how polio had changed her husband, she thought for a moment and said that it had made him grow up. Before the illness, he had been intelligent and full of life. but there had still been something shallow about him underneath, as if life had never truly touched him. After the illness, he became deeper in a way she could not explain with any word other than that one. He had come to know pain, and only someone who knows pain can truly understand the pain of others. Chapter 3: The Man Who Rose from the Wheelchair. In 1924, Franklin Roosevelt first heard about a warm spring in Warm Springs, Georgia. People said the water there stayed strangely warm all year round, and that a polio patient had once swum in it and felt his body move better afterward. To most people, this might have been just a folk tale worth hearing and forgetting. To Franklin Roosevelt, after 3 years of struggling with legs that no longer obeyed him, it was a glimmer of hope worth chasing. He went to Warm Springs and slid into the natural pool for the first time with the caution of a man too familiar with disappointment. The warm water surrounded him, and something happened. It was not a miracle. His legs did not suddenly work again, but in that warm, mineral-rich water, his body floated more naturally, felt lighter, and muscle groups that had withered over the years began to move in ways they could not on land. He could swim, and when he swam, for the first time in years, he felt like an ordinary man again. He returned to Warm Springs many times over the following years. Then, he decided to buy the entire rundown old resort there, using 2/3 of his personal fortune, a decision that nearly gave Sarah and his financial advisors a heart attack. He renovated the facility, built more pools, and founded the Warm Springs Foundation, where poor polio patients from across America could come for treatment at low cost or free of charge. This was the first time Franklin Roosevelt spent his own money, not funds from the state budget or someone else's charity, but his own money to do something for people he did not know and would never meet again. But more important than the money were the months he spent living in Warm Springs, sitting down to dinner with Georgia farmers, listening to them talk about failed harvests, bank debts, and children forced to drop out of school to work. The man who had grown up on the Hyde Park estate and studied at Harvard sat listening to the stories of people who had never finished the 8th grade. And he truly listened, not the way a politician listens to constituents, only to forget the moment he turns away. Warm Springs taught Franklin Roosevelt something no school ever could: what life looked like from the inside for most Americans. While Franklin was swimming and learning about life in Georgia, Eleanor Roosevelt was doing something entirely different in New York. After 1921, Louis Howe had convinced Eleanor that if Franklin wanted to return to politics, someone needed to keep his name alive in the minds of Democrats around the country while he recovered. And that person, Howe suggested, should be Eleanor. At the time, Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman shy in front of crowds, unused to public speaking, and lacking confidence in her own political abilities. Howe sat her down and taught her one thing at a time: how to stand at a microphone, how to look straight at the crowd instead of down at her notes, how to finish one sentence before starting the next instead of rambling nonstop the way a nervous person does. He criticized her bluntly and without mercy. Eleanor learned, and learned fast. She began joining Democratic women's organizations, attending conferences, speaking on women's rights and labor rights. She went into poor New York neighborhoods her husband had never set foot in, talking with women workers about conditions in the garment factories, children working in mills, families living crammed into windowless apartments. She brought those stories home and told them to Franklin during the evenings. The two of them sat together. Eleanor became Franklin Roosevelt's eyes and legs during the years he could not move freely on his own. And in the process, she became a politician in the truest sense of the word, not because she wanted power for herself, but because she genuinely believed in what she was saying. In 1924, Franklin Roosevelt appeared in public for the first time in the 3 years since his illness. He was invited to give the nominating speech for Alfred Smith at the Democratic National Convention in New York. To reach the podium, he had to walk on crutches, leaning on his son's arm, one step at a time, while thousands of people in the hall watched in silence. Those present that day later said the atmosphere in the hall was strange in a way hard to put into words. People held their breath. Some looked down, unable to watch. Then Franklin Roosevelt reached the podium, gripped its edge with both hands, raised his head, and smiled at the crowd below, a wide, easy smile, as if he had simply strolled up from a pleasant outing. The hall broke into applause. Then he began to speak, and his voice, the warm, clear voice he had honed over years of public speaking, filled the hall. He called Alfred Smith the Happy Warrior, a phrase people would remember from that speech for years, even though Smith did not win the nomination that year. Few people remembered much about Alfred Smith after that night. They remembered Franklin Roosevelt. The press wrote about him in a tone bordering on amazement. Here was a man who had been paralyzed 3 years earlier and whose career people had assumed was over. Here he stood before thousands of people, his legs unable to support his own body, and he spoke as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Louis Howe read every one of those articles and nodded with satisfaction. This was exactly what he had wanted. But the public did not know one thing the press knew and had agreed to keep quiet. Throughout the years of Roosevelt's political career, there was an unwritten agreement, never put on paper, but followed almost without exception. The American press did not photograph Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and did not write about his disability in a way that would lead readers to picture him as weak or incapable of leadership. This was an unspoken pact between the press and their hero, and it reflected a reality of American society at the time. A disabled person was not seen as someone capable of holding power. People could feel sympathy for them, could admire their courage, but could not picture them sitting behind the president's desk. Roosevelt understood this and accepted it with cold pragmatism. He developed an elaborate system for appearing in public in ways he could fully control. When he had to cover a long distance, he leaned on the arm of his son or an aide, making it look as though the two were simply walking side by side rather than one supporting the other. When he had to stand and speak, he gripped the podium tightly and did not move. When getting into a car, he did it quickly, and photographers were asked to look away during that moment. Throughout his 12 years as president, only 2 photographs of Franklin Roosevelt in his wheelchair were ever known to exist, and both were candid shots, never approved for publication during his lifetime. In 1928, Alfred Smith won the Democratic presidential nomination this time, and he needed someone strong to run for governor of New York to keep this crucial state in Democratic hands. Smith asked Franklin Roosevelt to run. Roosevelt hesitated. He wanted a few more years to keep recovering, to keep training at Warm Springs, holding on to the fragile hope that he might yet learn to walk without crutches. Smith persisted. The New York Democratic Party persisted. Finally, Eleanor Roosevelt called her husband at Warm Springs and told him the time had come. Franklin Roosevelt agreed to run. He won the New York gubernatorial race by a very narrow margin, fewer than 25,000 votes out of more than 4 million cast, while Alfred Smith lost badly to Herbert Hoover in the race for the White House. But Franklin Roosevelt, now governor of America's largest and most influential state, stood at a position everyone could see led somewhere higher still. Then October 1929 arrived, and America collapsed. The stock market crashed in the final days of October in a way that no one, not even the finest economists, had foreseen in its true scale. Within a few weeks, billions of dollars in wealth evaporated. Banks began failing one after another. Factories shut down. Workers lost their jobs. Farmers could not sell their crops. And so, like a rotted roof collapsing section by section, the largest economy in the world began to fall apart. By 1932, a quarter of the American workforce was out of work. Long lines stretched in front of soup kitchens as people waited for a single bowl. Makeshift shanty towns of cardboard and rusted tin sprang up on the edges of major cities, and people called them Hoovervilles, a quiet accusation built into the name of President Herbert Hoover. Hoover believed the economy would recover on its own if the government did not interfere, and he held that position while people lined up in the streets begging for food. As governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt did what Hoover refused to do. He intervened. He set up a state emergency relief agency, spending tens of millions of dollars to provide food, fuel, and financial assistance to those who had lost their jobs. He called for higher taxes on the wealthy to fund relief programs, a controversial decision he made without much hesitation. He also did something few politicians of the time thought to do. He explained to the people why he was doing what he was doing. He spoke to the press regularly and candidly, never dodging hard questions. He visited the hardest hit areas, sat down to eat with struggling families, and listened. These trips were not for photo opportunities or political points, though they did earn him both. They came from a genuine wish to understand what the Great Depression looked like from inside those empty kitchens and worried faces. His reputation spread beyond the borders of New York. While Hoover in Washington kept insisting that prosperity was just around the corner, Roosevelt in Albany was actually doing something, even if it was far smaller than the scale of the disaster called for. People began looking toward him. The press began writing about him as a potential presidential candidate for 1932. Roosevelt and Louis Howe had begun preparing for this years earlier. Howe, who had spent a decade building Roosevelt's network of relationships, state by state, county by county, city by city, was now harvesting what he had sown. Democrats across the country knew the name Roosevelt. They had read his letters, heard radio announcers say his name while reporting on new policies in New York, and met his representatives at local party conventions. In 1932, the Democratic Party held its presidential nominating convention in Chicago. After 4 tense rounds of voting and all-night backroom negotiations, Franklin Roosevelt won the nomination. He did something no nominee had ever done before. Instead of waiting at home for official notification as tradition dictated, he boarded a plane immediately and flew through the night to Chicago to accept the nomination in person before the convention. The flight took more than 9 hours because of repeated refueling stops and a storm along the way, but he arrived in Chicago and walked out before the crowd with a wide smile, as though it had been a pleasant trip. In his acceptance speech, he said a line whose true weight no one fully grasped in that moment, but which later became one of the most important statements in American political history. He promised to bring the American people a new deal. A new deal. America, at the end of 1932, was a country exhausted in a deeper sense than hunger and unemployment. It was an exhaustion of faith. People were no longer sure the system could be fixed at all. In Europe, people losing faith in democracy and the market economy were turning toward extremes: fascism in Italy and Germany, communism in the Soviet Union. Even in America, voices were beginning to ask whether democracy was truly capable of solving a crisis of this scale. Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in the November 1932 election in a landslide, carrying 42 of 48 states. But between Election Day in November and Inauguration Day in March 1933, under the old American calendar, things grew even worse. Hundreds more banks closed in those months. Millions more people lost their jobs. The country was waiting for the man in the wheelchair to arrive in Washington and do something. The night before the inauguration, Franklin Roosevelt sat alone in his room at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, writing the final words of his inaugural address. Outside the window, the Capitol lay in the darkness and cold of a March night. Inside, the man who had lost the use of his legs and found himself again in the warm springs of Georgia, who had learned about real life from Southern farmers and poor patients, who had waited years for this moment through a fractured marriage and a paralyzed body, was preparing to step before a panicked nation and tell them that everything would be all right. He only needed to convince them to believe it, and to do that, he first had to believe it himself. He folded the paper, turned off the light, and went to sleep. Tomorrow, America would begin a new chapter, and he would be the one to write its first pages. Chapter 4: The 100 Days That Shook America. The morning of the 4th of March, 1933, was one of the bleakest mornings in modern American history. Not because of the weather, though the sky over Washington that day was gray and cold in the most literal sense, but because of what was happening to the country at the very moment the newly elected man was preparing to place his hand on the Bible and swear his oath of office. The night before, the governor of New York had ordered the entire state banking system shut down. Early that same morning, before the ceremony even began, more governors did the same. By the time Franklin Roosevelt placed his hand on the Roosevelt family's heirloom Bible and recited the oath, banks in 38 of the 48 states had either closed or were operating under severe restrictions. Americans could not withdraw their own money. The financial system of the richest nation on earth stood on the edge of total collapse. That was the situation Franklin Roosevelt walked into as he became the 32nd President of the United States. He opened his inaugural address with words he had written by hand the night before in his hotel room, and they rang out over the loudspeakers across Capitol Plaza, carried by radio into millions of kitchens and living rooms across America, where people sat in silence beside their small radios, listening. First of all, he said, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The line hung in the air for a second before the crowd broke into applause. But Roosevelt did not pause to savor the moment. He kept speaking, his voice calm and clear, laying out plainly what was wrong with America without dodging or dressing it up. Banks collapsing, farmers losing their land, workers losing their jobs, the life savings of millions of families gone. He promised no miracles. He promised action, immediate action, and he used that word again and again in the speech like a deliberate refrain. Millions of Americans sat listening to that broadcast in silence. Many later said they did not remember his exact words, but they remembered how it felt to hear him speak. The feeling that this man knew just how bad things were and was not afraid to say so plainly, and that he did not seem to be panicking. In a country gripped by panic, a leader's calm was worth more than gold. Roosevelt finished the inauguration, ate lunch, and got to work that very afternoon. He called an emergency meeting with his economic advisors and the Secretary of the Treasury. They worked late into the night. The next morning, March 5th, Roosevelt used emergency executive power to declare a 4-day closure of the entire federal banking system, a move his lawyers argued about all night over its legality, but which Roosevelt decided to carry out on the simple reasoning that doing nothing would be far worse than any legal consequence. During those 4 days, while the banks were closed, hundreds of financial examiners were sent out to inspect the books of every major bank in the country. Banks with solid financial footing would be allowed to reopen. Banks too weak to survive would be shut down permanently or reorganized. The idea was simple to the point of being bold. Instead of leaving people unsure which banks were safe and which were not, have the government itself stand behind the guarantee that any bank allowed to reopen could be trusted. But Roosevelt understood that a technical decision alone was not enough. He needed the people to believe in it. And so, on the evening of the 12th of March, 1933, 8 days after taking office, Franklin Roosevelt sat down in front of a microphone in the diplomatic reception room of the White House and did something no president had ever done in quite that way before. He opened with a line so deliberately plain it sounded almost ordinary. "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking." Not the language of a politician, not the language of an official announcement. He spoke like a neighbor, sitting down at your kitchen table to explain what was happening to your family's savings. He explained how banks worked, why they had failed, what the government was doing to examine them, and why, when they reopened the next day, people could trust putting their money back in. He spoke for about 15 minutes. Then he thanked everyone for listening and closed. The next morning, when the government-approved banks reopened, people lined up outside, but not to withdraw money the way they had in the weeks before. They lined up to deposit it. People brought the cash they had hidden under mattresses or in tin boxes in their kitchen cabinets ever since they had lost faith in banks and brought it back to deposit. Within 3 days, more than $1 billion in cash flowed back into the American banking system. This was the moment Franklin Roosevelt fully understood something he had only sensed vaguely before. Radio was the most powerful political weapon a president had ever held, and he knew how to use it better than anyone. Those Sunday evening broadcasts later became known as the fireside chats. The name was not Roosevelt's own invention, but was coined by a radio reporter, and it fit so perfectly that everyone adopted it at once. Because that was exactly the feeling those broadcasts created. Not a president reading an announcement, but a trustworthy man sitting down to tell you what was happening and why you did not need to be afraid. Over his 12 years as president, Roosevelt gave 31 fireside chats. That number stayed deliberately small because he understood that if he spoke too often, people would stop listening. Every time he went on the air, it was an event. People stopped whatever they were doing to listen. But the radio broadcasts were only one part of what happened during those first 100 days. The more important part unfolded in the halls of Congress, and it unfolded at a pace never before seen in the legislative history of any major democracy. Roosevelt understood that he had a narrow window of time. When a crisis is big enough, people become willing to accept changes they would fiercely oppose under normal conditions. That window would not stay open forever. He had to accomplish as much as possible in as little time as possible. In the first 14 weeks of his term, Congress passed 15 major pieces of legislation. This was a number that in ordinary years might take many years to achieve, and most of these bills were proposed and passed within days, sometimes within hours. In the atmosphere of emergency that Roosevelt deliberately created and sustained. One of the first laws established the Civilian Conservation Corps, commonly known as the CCC. The idea was simple enough for anyone to grasp immediately. Millions of young American men were out of work, while national parks, national forests, and public lands across the country were deteriorating from neglect. Why not send those young men into the woods to plant trees, build small dams to prevent erosion, cut trails, and set up camps? Within 3 months, 300,000 young men had joined the CCC. By the time the program ended 9 years later, more than 3 million Americans had taken part, planting more than 3 billion trees, building thousands of small structures across the country, and earning wages enough to send home to support their families. Many of the forests and national parks Americans visit today still bear traces left by the hands of CCC youths from 80 years ago. Next came a wave of laws restructuring the financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act completely separated commercial banking from securities investment activity, closing off the kinds of risks that had led to the 1929 crash. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, guaranteeing that if a bank failed, the federal government would repay depositors up to a certain amount. This is something Americans still benefit from today, even though most have no idea where it came from. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to oversee the stock market, curbing the speculation and fraud that had helped inflate the financial bubble before 1929. But perhaps the most ambitious and controversial project of those first 100 days was the Tennessee Valley Authority, known as the TVA. The Tennessee Valley, stretching across 7 southern states, was one of the poorest regions in the entire country. Recurring floods destroyed crops every year. The soil was severely eroded. And more important than all of that, most of the rural population in the region had no electricity. Not because they did not want it, but because private power companies found it unprofitable to run lines to the scattered farms of the southern mountains and simply did not do it. Roosevelt proposed that the federal government build dams, generate electricity, and sell it cheaply to the people of the region. The private business world protested fiercely, calling it socialism, calling it government overreach into private industry. Roosevelt paid it no mind. The TVA was established and began building a system of dams across the entire Tennessee Valley. Within a decade, a region that had once been one of the poorest in America had electricity, controlled flooding, less soil erosion, and jobs from the massive construction projects. This was not an economic miracle, but the result of a simple decision. Sometimes the free market is not enough, and government must step in to do what the market will not. Beyond these policy successes, the first 100 days mattered for something harder to measure, but perhaps more important than any single law: the feeling that the government was functioning, that someone was at the wheel, that Washington was no longer asleep while the country sank. Roosevelt worked from morning until late at night every day, and he did it with an ease and even cheerfulness that the people who worked alongside him never forgot. He laughed often, told jokes, made light of tense meetings. He ate at his desk and received visitors while he ate. He read through documents so quickly his aides could barely keep up. And he made decisions, not perfect decisions or ones weighed carefully down to every detail, but decisions good enough and fast enough. He told an aide in those early weeks that if they tried 10 things and 6 of them worked, he would be satisfied with that outcome. This was not the statement of a perfectionist. It was the statement of a man who understood that in a crisis, acting imperfectly was far better than doing nothing while waiting for a perfect solution that would never come. But not everything went smoothly, and Roosevelt made no effort to pretend otherwise. From the political right, business leaders and financiers began voicing opposition from the very first months. They called Roosevelt a traitor to his class, a man using the taxes of the wealthy to fund programs they considered unnecessary and dangerous. Some members of New York's upper class, people who had once dined with the Roosevelt family and considered him one of their own, now refused to say his name at the dinner table and referred to him only as that traitor in the White House. Roosevelt heard about all of this and changed nothing. He even seemed at times to take genuine pleasure in their anger, as if it were proof he was on the right track. From the left, progressive activists and intellectuals complained that Roosevelt had not done enough, that he was patching up a broken system instead of replacing it. That capitalism truly needed a far more radical overhaul than anything the New Deal was offering. Roosevelt answered them with pragmatic silence. He was not an idealist. He had no interest in replacing the system. He was interested in saving it before it collapsed completely and took everyone down with it. The second, third, and fourth fireside chats followed, one after another. Each one took up a different subject. Agriculture one time, employment another, those exploiting the crisis for illicit profit yet another. Roosevelt talked about complicated matters in language ordinary people could understand, not because he thought little of his listeners' intelligence, but because he understood that even the best policy in the world was useless if people did not understand why it needed to exist. Letters poured into the White House on a scale never before seen in history. In the weeks following the inauguration, an average of 500,000 letters arrived in Washington every week. People wrote about their own circumstances, about what the government was getting right, about what it was getting wrong, and about how it felt to finally have a president who spoke to them rather than over their heads. Roosevelt read many of those letters, not all of them, of course, but enough to know what people were thinking and feeling. By the end of June 1933, when the first 100 days officially came to a close, America had not yet escaped the Great Depression. Unemployment was still high. Farmers were still struggling. Many banks were still weak. It would take many more years and a world war before the American economy truly recovered in full. But what changed during those 100 days cannot be measured in economic statistics. What changed was how people felt about their country and about their government. 3 months earlier, people had lined up to withdraw their money for fear that banks would collapse. Now, they lined up to deposit it. 3 months earlier, the question many people quietly asked themselves was whether democracy could solve a crisis of this scale at all, or whether the country needed a firmer hand, the kind taking hold in Europe. Now, that question was no longer being asked, not because it had been answered philosophically, but because people were busy with the concrete, practical things the government was now doing for them. That was the real achievement of the first 100 days, not the laws signed, important as they were. It was that Roosevelt had kept America believing in itself at the exact moment that belief had nearly run dry. Years later, historians still debate whether the New Deal was truly effective economically or whether it was the war that actually pulled America out of the Great Depression. That remains an interesting academic debate without a definitive answer. But there is one thing no one debates. In the spring of 1933, a country in panic and adrift found its breath again. And the man sitting in a wheelchair in the White House, speaking to millions of American families over the radio in the calm tone of a trustworthy neighbor, was the single most important reason why. He did not save America with a perfect plan. He saved America by making people believe their country was worth saving and could be saved. Sometimes that is all leadership means. Chapter 5. Architect of Modern America. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt entered the third year of his first term with a clearer understanding of what he was truly doing. He was not simply saving America from the Great Depression. He was fundamentally changing the relationship between government and the American people, a relationship that had been built on the belief that the best government was the one that intervened least, and that every person was responsible for looking after himself. Roosevelt did not openly reject that belief. He simply, quietly built something else alongside it, brick by brick, until that something grew too large and too necessary to tear down. The period people call the Second New Deal began in 1935, and it was more ambitious, more progressive, and far more consequential than the emergency measures of the first 100 days. In August 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. This was the law he considered the most important of his entire career, and he had good reason to think so. Before 1935, growing old in America meant dependence. If you did not have children able to support you, if you had no savings, if your health no longer let you keep working, you depended on the charity of others or had to move into a locally run poorhouse. That was the reality for millions of elderly Americans, and the Great Depression had made that reality far worse by wiping out their life savings in collapsing banks. The Social Security Act, for the first time in American history, established a federal pension system in which workers contributed a small portion of their wages into a shared fund throughout their working years, and upon retirement, received a monthly payment enough to cover basic living costs without depending on their children or on the charity of others. The idea itself was not new. Germany had built a similar system dating back to Bismarck in the late 19th century. Many European countries had also built their own social protection systems. But in America, where a philosophy of self-reliance and suspicion of anything resembling collectivism ran deep in the national culture, this proposal ran into fierce opposition from those who called it the first step towards socialism. Roosevelt answered with a simple, shrewd argument. This was not charity, it was insurance. Workers were paying into a fund of their own. The government merely managed that fund and made sure no one lost their share. There was nothing to be ashamed of in receiving back what one had already put in. That same year, Roosevelt signed the Wagner Act, which many would later call the Magna Carta of American labor. Before this law existed, American workers had almost no legal protection when facing off against their employers. They could be fired for joining a union. Employers could hire strikebreakers, could carry out mass layoffs the moment anyone dared to organize workers for better conditions. The Wagner Act, for the first time, placed workers' rights to organize unions and bargain collectively under federal protection. It established the National Labor Relations Board to resolve disputes between employers and workers through legal process instead of violence or coercion. In the years that followed, union membership in America surged, and working conditions for millions of American workers improved significantly. Employers hated this law. Roosevelt did not care. He said that if workers could not earn enough money to buy the goods the factories produced, then those factories would have no market to survive on. Protecting workers, in his view, was also protecting the economy. But perhaps the least known, yet most distinctive program in the entire New Deal was the Works Progress Administration, commonly called the WPA. The WPA, established in 1935, was the largest job creation program in American history. Over its 8 years of existence, it created jobs for more than 8 million Americans, and what they built still stands across the country to this day. 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, including schools, hospitals, airports, bridges, and post offices, and thousands of parks and playgrounds. But what set the WPA apart from any previous job creation program was that it did not only hire construction workers and road crews, it hired artists too. Roosevelt and his advisors held a simple belief: an unemployed artist was as much an American in need of work as any laborer, and art was not a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It was something everyone needed, especially in hard times when people's spirits needed nourishing just as much as their stomachs. The Federal Art Project, part of the WPA, hired thousands of painters to create murals in public buildings, schools, and post offices across America. Those paintings, many of which still exist today, told the story of the lives of ordinary Americans: farmers harvesting grain, steel workers casting metal, women caring for children, scenes of daily labor and everyday life. The Federal Theater Project brought performances to small towns and poor neighborhoods where people had never before seen a play, a dance, or live music. Tens of millions of Americans, for the first time in their lives, sat in an auditorium and watched real people perform in front of them. The Federal Writers Project hired unemployed writers and journalists to travel the country interviewing people and recording their stories. Those interviews formed a vast historical archive of the lives of ordinary Americans during the Great Depression years. Among those who took part in this program were writers who would later become major names in 20th century American literature. Through all those years, Eleanor Roosevelt was never merely the First Lady in the ordinary sense of the term. She visited coal mining regions in Kentucky while miners were on strike, climbing down into the mines to see their working conditions with her own eyes. She visited camps of migrant laborers fleeing poverty in the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma. She had lunch with black mothers in Harlem at a time when the White House itself remained a place black Americans could not easily enter. She wrote her daily newspaper column, My Day, in which she described what she saw on those trips in a plain, unadorned voice. Millions of people read that column every day as if reading the diary of a friend. Eleanor Roosevelt became the public conscience of the Roosevelt administration, standing in the shadows and reminding the husband sitting in the light of power that there were still people being left behind. Sometimes Franklin listened to her, sometimes he did not. But her voice was always there, and her presence pulled the New Deal further toward those most likely to be forgotten in American society than it would have gone without her. But not everything went smoothly for Roosevelt during those years. The Supreme Court, with a majority of justices appointed by Republican presidents and holding conservative views on the powers of the federal government, began striking down New Deal laws one after another, starting in 1935. They held that many of Roosevelt's programs exceeded the federal government's constitutional authority, infringing on states' rights and the freedom of private enterprise. In 1935 and 1936, the Supreme Court struck down a series of major New Deal laws. Roosevelt was furious. He won re-election in 1936 with the largest landslide in modern American presidential election history, carrying 46 of 48 states. And he read that victory as a clear mandate from the American people for his program. In early 1937, Roosevelt unveiled the most controversial plan of his career, one the press quickly dubbed the court-packing plan. He proposed allowing the president to appoint one additional new justice for every sitting justice over the age of 70 who refused to retire, with a total number of justices potentially rising to as many as 15 instead of the current 9. Since most of the justices striking down the New Deal were already over 70, this plan would, in effect, allow Roosevelt to appoint 6 new justices sympathetic to his program. The reaction from both parties was fierce and nearly instantaneous. Even the most ardent supporters of the New Deal in Congress were uncomfortable with the idea that a president could reshape the structure of the Supreme Court simply because the court stood in his way. This struck at the separation of powers, one of the fundamental pillars of the American Constitution. The court-packing plan failed in Congress. It was the largest and most painful legislative defeat of Roosevelt's presidency up to that point. But something strange happened right after that plan failed. The Supreme Court began to shift its position. In the months that followed, the same Supreme Court began handing down rulings that upheld New Deal laws. One conservative justice, who had previously voted against many of Roosevelt's programs, suddenly began voting the other way. Historians have called this the switch in time that saved 9, and have argued endlessly over its true cause. Perhaps that justice genuinely changed his legal position. Perhaps political pressure from Roosevelt's overwhelming 1,936 victory played a role. Perhaps both. Whatever the true cause, the result was that both the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act were upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court, and the New Deal survived. The years from 1933 to 1939 left physical traces across America that people still use and admire every day, often without knowing where they came from. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco was completed in 1937. LaGuardia Airport in New York was built during this period. Hoover Dam, holding back the Colorado River, creating the largest artificial lake in America and supplying electricity to the entire Southwest region, was completed in 1936. Thousands of elementary schools in small towns across the country, hundreds of community hospitals, dozens of local airports, all carry the mark of the New Deal years. This was Roosevelt's most concrete, tangible legacy, the kind people could drive across, fly over, or send their children to be educated in. But Roosevelt always considered that only the surface of what he was truly building. What he was truly building was an American middle class standing on a foundation more solid than at any point in the nation's history. Before the New Deal, the life of an ordinary American worker was a chain of risks with no safety net beneath it. Losing a job meant losing everything. Growing old meant dependence. Illness meant ruin. A lifetime of savings could vanish overnight if a bank collapsed. People lived under the constant fear that everything they had built could be swept away at any moment. The New Deal did not eliminate those risks entirely, but it placed a floor beneath people's lives, a minimum level of protection below which they could not fall. Social Security meant that in old age you would not starve. Deposit insurance meant your savings were safe in the bank. Union rights meant you could negotiate working conditions without being fired on the spot. Electricity from the TVA meant your children could do their homework at night under a light bulb instead of a candle. These things sound small when read back in history books. To the people living through them in the 1930s, they were the difference of an entire lifetime. By the late 1930s, America had not yet fully escaped the Great Depression. Unemployment remained far higher than before 1929. The economy even contracted again in 1937 when Roosevelt, worried about the budget deficit, cut spending too soon before the economy was strong enough to stand on its own. He had to quickly reverse that decision as conditions worsened. But while the economics still had plenty of problems left to solve, what Roosevelt permanently changed was something deeper and more lasting. He changed what the American people expected their government owed them. Before Roosevelt, most Americans accepted that government had no responsibility to intervene when the economy collapsed, that such matters belonged to the market and to each individual looking after himself. After Roosevelt, that expectation changed irreversibly. Americans came to believe that when everything fell apart, their government had a responsibility to step in and do something. Any president who came after Roosevelt, regardless of party, would have to accept and operate within that political reality. There is a small story many people tell about Roosevelt from those years, a story that may be true or may simply be a legend, but which, either way, says something real about the kind of man he was. One afternoon, when a delegation of businessmen came to the White House to complain about New Deal policies causing them trouble, Roosevelt listened to them patiently for nearly an hour. Then he nodded, thanked them for coming, and as they prepared to leave, he said in a friendly but pointed tone, "Gentlemen, I saved capitalism from the capitalists themselves." That may have been arrogance, but it may also have been the truth. In 1933, extremists on both sides, those who wanted a communist revolution and those who wanted a fascist-style dictatorship, both believed the American capitalist democratic system was dying. Roosevelt proved them both wrong. The system could repair itself, could adapt, could care for its weakest members, while still protecting the basic freedoms of the individual. That is what Roosevelt built during the 1930s. Not a perfect America, but an America fair enough and flexible enough to keep standing as the clouds of a new world war gathered on the horizon. And that storm was drawing closer with every passing day. Chapter 6. A Lonely Man Before the Storm. In the early morning of the 1st of September, 1939, 1.5 million German troops crossed the border and poured into Poland from 3 directions at once. This was the largest coordinated attack in the history of warfare up to that point, combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry under a new doctrine the Germans called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Polish army fought bravely, but stood no real chance against a war machine that had been prepared meticulously for years. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany to honor their pledge to defend Poland. World War II had begun. At the White House, Franklin Roosevelt received the news at 2:50 in the morning by telephone from the American ambassador to France. He lay in bed, listened, hung up, and could not fall back asleep. He told an aide that this was something he had known was coming for a long time, and that knowing it did not make it feel any lighter. Roosevelt understood at once that this war would change the world in ways most Americans were not yet ready to face. He also understood something practical and painful. He could not say that plainly to the American people, at least not yet, because America in 1939 did not want to hear about war. The isolationist movement in America in the late 1930s was one of the most powerful political movements in the country's history. It was not the position of cowards or the uninformed. It was a view shared by millions of ordinary Americans, people who remembered clearly that World War I had killed more than 110,000 Americans, that the noble reasons given to justify that war had turned out to be largely dishonest, and that Europe after World War I remained a tangle of old disputes and grudges that Americans had no obligation to untangle. The America First Committee, founded in 1940, drew hundreds of thousands of members from every walk of life. Its most famous spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, the first aviation hero to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927, a man admired across America as a symbol of courage and American talent. Lindbergh traveled the country arguing that America had no reason to join a European war. That war might be unavoidable on that continent, but it was not America's problem, and that those pushing America toward war were acting for their own interests rather than the country's. America First rallies drew tens of thousands of people. Letters of protest poured into the White House every time Roosevelt made any move that could be read as pulling America closer to war. Roosevelt watched the situation in Europe with growing alarm through the winter and spring of 1940. In April, Germany attacked and occupied Denmark and Norway within weeks. In May, they swept into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Then in June, something many people had thought impossible happened. France fell. France, one of the world's leading military powers, with a large army and a defensive system considered impregnable, surrendered to Germany after less than 6 weeks of fighting. This was the greatest geopolitical shock the Western world had experienced since World War I, and it forced even the most ardent isolationists in America to stop and reconsider. Now Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in Europe. Winston Churchill had just become Prime Minister of Britain in May 1940, replacing Neville Chamberlain, who had wrongly believed peace could be negotiated with Hitler. Churchill held no such illusion. He knew this war would have to be fought to the end, and he had no plan other than to fight. But Britain needed weapons. Britain needed ammunition. Britain needed warships, and Britain needed to know it was not entirely alone. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt as soon as he took office, and the two men began a secret correspondence that would stretch on for years and would later be regarded as one of the most important diplomatic exchanges of the 20th century. Churchill wrote with all his distinctive literary skill, painting a picture of a Britain fighting for the survival of Western civilization, and he did not hesitate to ask the blunt question, where would America stand? Roosevelt read those letters and wrote back with all the personal warmth and political caution of a man balancing what he believed was right against what he knew the American people were willing to accept at that moment. In September 1940, Roosevelt made a bold move that he did not submit to Congress for approval, knowing Congress would reject it. Using executive authority, he gave Britain 50 old destroyers sitting in the American Navy's reserve in exchange for the right to lease British military bases in the Caribbean and the Atlantic for 99 years. Legally and technically, this was a trade deal, not military aid, but everyone understood what it truly was. America was helping Britain, even though it had not yet officially entered the war. The isolationists were outraged. Roosevelt defended the move with a national security argument. The American bases gained in the Caribbean and Atlantic strengthened America's own defenses. This was something he had learned over years in politics, how to package a decision in language his opponents would find hardest to argue against. November 1940 brought the presidential election. Roosevelt decided to run for a third term, breaking the unwritten tradition dating back to George Washington that no one should hold the presidency for more than 2 terms. This was a controversial decision even within the Democratic Party itself. Many thought it was excessive arrogance, that no one was irreplaceable, not even Roosevelt. Roosevelt explained his decision in his own way, not in public speeches, but in private conversations with those he trusted most. He said he did not want another 4 years. His body was tired, and he knew it. But Europe was in a state of emergency, and he did not believe anyone else in the Democratic Party had the experience and the international relationships needed to handle what was coming. During the campaign, Roosevelt promised American mothers the thing he knew they most wanted to hear: their sons would not be sent into any foreign war. This was a promise he knew he might not be able to keep, and whether he truly believed it as he said it is a question historians still debate. But he said it, and the American people elected him once again. In early 1941, Britain's financial situation reached a breaking point. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt with a bluntness rare in diplomacy. Britain was out of money. They no longer had the means to pay for weapons. If America could not find another way to help, Britain would not be able to keep fighting. Roosevelt read that letter aboard a ship during a short rest trip in the Caribbean and thought it over for several days. Then he returned to Washington with an idea he presented to the press using a comparison simple enough for anyone to grasp at once. He said, "If my neighbor's house is on fire and I have a garden hose, I would not tell him to pay me $15 before I lend him the hose. I would hand him the hose first, and once the fire was out, he would give it back to me." That was Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease Act was passed by Congress in March 1941 after weeks of fierce debate. It allowed the president to sell, lend, lease, or trade weapons and military equipment to any nation he considered vital to American security without requiring immediate payment. In practice, this meant America would manufacture weapons and send them to Britain, and later to the Soviet Union once Germany invaded it in June 1941, without requiring those countries to pay while they were fighting for their survival. Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, and the name stuck. The isolationists called this a certain first step toward war. They were not entirely wrong. But Roosevelt argued that a defeated Britain and a Europe entirely under Nazi control would pose an existential threat to America, and that preventing this by supplying weapons without direct combat was the best option available. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met in secret for the first time in their lives. The meeting took place aboard two warships anchored side by side off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, amid the fog of the Atlantic, far from the sight of the press and the public. Churchill arrived aboard the Royal Navy battleship HMS Prince of Wales, crossing the Atlantic at risk of attack by German submarines. Roosevelt slipped away from Washington secretly aboard the USS Augusta, telling the press he was going on a fishing trip to rest. The two men met on the deck of the ship. Churchill, who had been writing to Roosevelt for over a year and had spoken with him by phone many times, finally stood before the man on whom he was staking Britain's future. Roosevelt, who had read dozens of Churchill's eloquent letters, saw before him a short, round man with a cigar and a felt hat. The two liked each other at once, though how genuine that liking truly was remained something the two men would assess differently in later years. Over 3 days at sea, Roosevelt and Churchill, along with their advisors, drafted a document that would later be called the Atlantic Charter. This document, released on August 14th, was not a military alliance treaty, since America had not yet entered the war. It was a statement of the principles the two countries believed the post-war world should be built upon: the right of peoples to self-determination, free trade, disarmament, and a shared international security system to prevent future wars. Those principles sound idealistic and abstract when read today, but they were the ideological foundation for what would later become the United Nations, the World Bank, and the post-war international order the world still lives within to this day. The two men parted ways after 3 days, not knowing they would meet many more times in the years ahead, and not knowing that the battleship HMS Prince of Wales that had carried Churchill to this meeting would be sunk by Japanese submarines just 4 months later. During the middle months of 1941, Roosevelt was carrying out an extraordinarily difficult political task that few fully appreciated from the outside. He was leading a nation in a direction he believed was right, while most of that nation's people were not yet ready to follow. He did it one small step at a time, each step framed in the least controversial way possible. American warships began escorting Lend-Lease cargo ships across the Atlantic, justified as protecting American property. When German submarines attacked American ships in a series of escalating incidents, Roosevelt used those incidents to persuade Congress to allow American merchant ships to be armed. He was steering the American ship toward war 1 degree at a time, slowly enough to avoid an uncontrollable wave of opposition, but steadily enough never to stop. In September 1940, for the first time in American peacetime history, the government instituted mandatory conscription. All American men between 21 and 35 had to register. Millions of young men began being called into the military for training. Roosevelt explained this as a defensive measure, that a militarily strong America would be less likely to be attacked and therefore less likely to be drawn into war. This was an argument people could believe or not, depending on how much they trusted Roosevelt. But whether people trusted Roosevelt or not, there was one objective fact no one could deny. By the fall of 1941, the world was changing at an irreversible pace, and America, whether it wanted to or not, was being pulled into the vortex of that change. On the other side of the globe, another power was watching events unfold in Europe and drawing its own conclusions. Japan, an empire expanding across Asia and the Pacific, saw that America was distracted by the crisis in Europe. It saw that the British, French, and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia stood largely undefended while their mother countries fought for survival in Europe. And it saw an opportunity. Roosevelt had imposed an oil and metals embargo on Japan in response to Japan's expanding aggression into China and Southeast Asia. This was powerful economic pressure, since Japan depended on America for more than 80% of its imported oil. Without oil, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within a couple of years. Japan faced a choice: yield to America's demands and withdraw from the territories it had occupied, or try to break the economic siege by force. Throughout November 1941, Japanese and American diplomats met repeatedly to negotiate. The American side demanded that Japan withdraw completely from China and Indochina. The Japanese side could not accept that without abandoning its imperial ambitions entirely. The two sides kept talking, but neither was willing to give ground on what mattered most to them. American intelligence had broken Japan's diplomatic codes and knew the Japanese were preparing for a major military move. Roosevelt and his military advisors assessed that the attack would likely fall on Southeast Asia, perhaps the Philippines or Malaya. No one in Washington correctly predicted where the actual blow would land. On a night at the end of November 1941, Franklin Roosevelt sat alone after his advisors had gone home. On his desk lay intelligence reports, unresolved diplomatic cables, and a file on the military situation in the Pacific. He had known for a long time that this war would eventually find America, whether America wanted it or not. He had done everything he could to prepare the country, one small step at a time, within the limits of what the American people would accept. But the decisive moment had not yet arrived, and he did not know where it would come from or when. He would not have to wait much longer. Chapter 7: A Day of Infamy and America Awakens. Sunday, the 7th of December 1941, began like an ordinary morning at Pearl Harbor. American soldiers and sailors stationed at the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific were sleeping in, enjoying the privilege of a day off. Some were eating breakfast. Some were getting ready for church. The air carried the feel of a tropical Sunday morning, warm and lazy in the best sense of the word, drifting across the harbor. At 7:48 in the morning, the first sounds appeared in the sky from the north. The drone of engines. Then the shapes of planes. Then everything at once. 183 Japanese aircraft in the first wave of attack descended on Pearl Harbor with the coordination and precision of an operation planned and rehearsed for months. Torpedoes launched from aircraft plunged straight into the anchored battleships. Armor-piercing bombs fell onto ship decks and exploded inside the hulls. Japanese fighter planes swept along the runways, destroying dozens of American aircraft still parked on the ground, never able to take off. The battleship USS Arizona took an armor-piercing bomb into its forward magazine and exploded in a massive blast visible from across the entire harbor. The ship sank in under 9 minutes, taking 1,177 sailors and Marines down with it, most of them never recovered and still resting in the wreck to this day. A second wave arrived about 45 minutes later with 171 more aircraft. By the time it all ended, around 9:45 in the morning, less than 2 hours after it began, Pearl Harbor lay shrouded in black smoke and fire. 8 battleships were hit, 4 of them sunk. 188 American aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed. 1,178 were wounded. At the White House, Franklin Roosevelt was eating lunch alone at his desk, going through paperwork as he usually did on quiet Sunday afternoons, when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called at around 1:40 in the afternoon Washington time. Pearl Harbor was under attack. This was real, not a drill. Roosevelt hung up the phone and, for a moment, said nothing. Those in the room later said his face shifted into an expression they found hard to describe. Not panic, not pure anger, but a heavy calm. The calm of a man who had just realized that the moment he had been dreading and preparing for over so many years had finally arrived. He began making calls. The Secretary of War, General Marshall, Secretary of State Hull, congressional leaders. He spoke briefly and clearly to each one, relaying what he knew, requesting what he needed, then moving on to the next call. That afternoon, the White House became the center of a whirlwind of information and decisions. Generals and admirals came and went. Cables from Hawaii kept updating the casualty count and the extent of the damage, each one worse than the last. Roosevelt sat at his desk, smoking one cigarette after another, reading every report, asking questions, and beginning to draft what he needed to say to Congress the next day. That evening, Eleanor hosted a dinner that had been planned for friends and public figures. She did not cancel it, since canceling would only spread more panic. But the mood at the table was heavy and silent in a way no one needed explained. Roosevelt did not join for dinner. He stayed in his office. He met with cabinet members at 8 p.m., then with congressional leaders at 9 p.m. In both meetings, he recounted what had happened in a calm, controlled voice, without exaggeration, without concealment. A senator present at that evening meeting later recalled that Roosevelt's calm in those hours was the calm of a man who had fully accepted the reality of the situation and was focused entirely on what needed to happen next. That night, Roosevelt sat alone and wrote the speech for the following day. He wrote and crossed out, rewrote, adjusted word after word. He knew this speech would become one of the most important in American history, and he wanted every word in it to be exactly right. On the 8th of December 1941, at 12:30 in the afternoon, Franklin Roosevelt was brought into the House chamber. No one among the hundreds present that day ever forgot the sight. Roosevelt entered with the help of his son James, who stood at his right, Roosevelt's right hand gripping his son's arm while his left hand held a cane. He wore a dark suit, his face solemn and resolute. Every step was an effort known fully only to him and his son, but he walked steadily and did not stop until he stood behind the podium, both hands gripping its edges. The whole chamber rose in applause. Roosevelt set the paper down on the podium, looked up, and began to speak. Yesterday, the 7th of December 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He delivered the speech in 6 minutes. 6 minutes, no more, no less. No ornate language, no long flourishes of rhetoric. He listed each attack Japan had carried out in the preceding hours, not only at Pearl Harbor, but also in Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island, all struck at nearly the same moment in a meticulously coordinated plan prepared well in advance. Then he said the final words Congress was waiting for. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The whole chamber rose to thunderous applause. Congress voted to declare war on Japan within 33 minutes. The vote in the Senate was 48-0. In the House, it was 388-1. The lone dissenting vote cast by Representative Jeanette Rankin, who had also voted against declaring war in World War I, and who now sat silent in the chamber amid jeers of protest from her colleagues around her. 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. This was one of the greatest strategic blunders in the history of world warfare, and much ink has been spilled analyzing why Hitler did it. He had no obligation to declare war on America under the terms of his treaty with Japan. He could have stood aside and let America focus entirely on the Pacific Front, at least for a while. Instead, he handed Roosevelt exactly what Roosevelt needed: a clear, legitimate reason to bring America into the war on both oceans at once. Italy declared war on America the same day. America responded by declaring war on both Germany and Italy that very day. The isolationist movement, which had blocked Roosevelt for more than 2 years, collapsed almost overnight. Charles Lindbergh announced he would end all his protest activities and called on Americans to unite behind their government. The America First Committee dissolved itself on the 11th of December, 1941. America entered the World War with a near total consensus among its people, achieved in a way Roosevelt had been unable to create over the previous 2 years, but which Japan had created in 2 hours at Pearl Harbor. In the days following Pearl Harbor, hundreds of thousands of young American men volunteered at recruiting offices across the country. Many stations did not have enough capacity to process everyone who showed up and had to ask people to return the following day. Boys as young as 17 convinced their parents to sign papers allowing them to enlist before the legal age. Men already past the age for the draft came in to ask if there was any way they could still serve. The transformation from a nation divided over war to a nation united to fight happened at a speed even Roosevelt had not fully anticipated. Pearl Harbor accomplished in a single stroke what 2 years of his speeches and persuasion could not. Roosevelt's mobilization of the wartime economy was one of the greatest organizational achievements in modern history. From the very first days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt began setting production targets that his generals and economists considered unrealistic to the point of near madness. He announced that America would produce 45,000 aircraft in 1942 and 150,000 in 1943. He announced America would build 8 million tons of shipping in 1942, rising to 10 million tons in 1943. He announced production of 45,000 tanks and 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. American automakers who had just signed major contracts with the government to produce weapons were invited to the White House and given these numbers. Some thought Roosevelt was joking. They explained that production lines needed time to convert, that raw materials needed to be allocated, that workers needed to be retrained. Roosevelt listened to them patiently, then said he understood all of that and still wanted those numbers achieved. The meeting ended. America made it happen and did it in a way that astonished the entire world. Within less than a year of Pearl Harbor, hundreds of factories that had once made cars, air conditioners, refrigerators, and household appliances across America had converted entirely to producing tanks, aircraft, warships, and ammunition. Ford's plant at Willow Run, Michigan, built specifically to manufacture B-24 bombers, eventually reached a production rate of 1 complete bomber every hour. As men went off to fight, women entered the factories. 6 million American women joined the industrial workforce during the war, many of whom had never worked outside the home before. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the muscular woman with her sleeves rolled up declaring that we can do it, became a symbol of a massive social shift that not only served the war effort, but permanently changed the understanding of women's role in American society. By 1944, America was producing more weapons than all the Axis powers combined, America alone. But within this story of great wartime mobilization lies a dark chapter that history cannot and should not skip over. On the 19th of February 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the U.S. military to designate any part of the country as a military zone and to exclude any person from those zones for reasons of security. In practice, this order led to the forced removal and internment of more than 110,000 people of Japanese descent living on the American West Coast, more than 2/3 of whom were legal American citizens born on American soil. They were required to sell or abandon their property, homes, and businesses within days, then were sent to detention camps in remote inland areas surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. They were charged with no crime. There was no evidence of espionage or sabotage from the Japanese American community. The FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence had in fact reported to Roosevelt that they did not consider this community a serious security threat. But political pressure from West Coast governors, public panic after Pearl Harbor, and a racial fear of Asians that had long existed in American society combined into a pressure Roosevelt did not stand firm against. This was the gravest error of Roosevelt's career, and he knew it even as he signed it. There is no record showing he ever defended the decision with any real conviction. He signed it because he judged that the political cost of not signing was higher than the moral cost of signing, and it is a calculation history has judged him very harshly for. In 1988, the American government formally apologized to the Japanese Americans who had been interned and paid compensation to the survivors. Executive Order 9066 has since been widely condemned as one of the most serious violations of civil rights in modern American history. There is no way to tell the story of Franklin Roosevelt without telling this story, and no way to excuse it. The bitter irony of history is that while their families sat behind barbed wire, thousands of young Japanese American men volunteered to join the U.S. Army and fight in Europe. The all-Japanese American 442nd Infantry Regiment became the most decorated unit in the history of the U.S. military relative to its size. They shed blood for a country that was treating their parents, siblings, and children as potential enemies. That remains one of the most painful and unresolvable paradoxes in the story of America's Second World War. In the early months of 1942, the war situation was extremely dire for the Allies. Japan attacked and occupied the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and dozens of Pacific islands at a stunning pace. In Africa, Germany was still advancing. In the Soviet Union, German forces were besieging Leningrad and had come close to Moscow the previous winter. German submarines were sinking Allied transport ships in the Atlantic at an alarming rate. Roosevelt received all of this news every single day. He did not share everything he knew with the public, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he understood that certain information in enemy hands could cause further harm, and because he knew a nation at war needed confidence, not more panic. He kept speaking to the American people over the radio. His voice remained calm. His speeches acknowledged the hardships but never showed despair. He reminded Americans that great wars were not won in a month or a year, that greater sacrifices still lay ahead, but that this country had overcome great trials before and would overcome this one too. By the end of 1942, the first signs that the tide was turning began to appear. In June 1942, the U.S. Navy won a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and breaking Japan's naval superiority in the Pacific. In November 1942, Allied forces landed in North Africa. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army was holding the line and preparing for its great counteroffensive at Stalingrad. The war still had a very long way to go. The price still to be paid was very great, but the direction ahead had begun to grow clearer. And the man in the wheelchair at the White House was coordinating all of it, day after day, week after week, from a body growing ever more tired, but from a will that never once wavered. His war had only just truly begun, and he knew the hardest years still lay ahead. Chapter 8: The Big Four and the Gamble of the Century. The World War was unlike anything humanity had ever experienced before. Not just because of its scale, though the scale itself was almost unimaginable, with more than 30 nations at war and tens of millions of soldiers fighting across battlefields stretching from the jungles of the Pacific to the deserts of North Africa, from the steppes of the Soviet Union to the waters of the Atlantic. But also because, for the first time in history, victory depended not only on the men holding rifles on the battlefield, but on the men sitting in closed meeting rooms in Washington, London, and Moscow, deciding who fought where, how much weaponry went to whom, and, more important than anything, how this war would end and what the world afterward would look like. Franklin Roosevelt stood at the center of all those decisions. From the very first days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt faced the war's most important strategic question: where should America concentrate its forces first, Europe or the Pacific? His answer, arrived at after weeks of debate with his generals and with Churchill, was Europe first. Germany, not Japan, was the real threat to Western civilization. Once Germany was defeated, Japan would not be able to hold out for long against the combined strength of the Allies. But if Germany won in Europe, the consequences would be irreversible. That strategy sounds obvious in hindsight, but in 1942, with Japan having just struck America and still devastating American forces across the Pacific, holding firm to a Europe-first decision required a resolve that not everyone in Roosevelt's cabinet and command shared. Roosevelt held firm, and that strategy, in hindsight, was the right one. The relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill was one of the most important personal alliances of the 20th century, and it was far more complicated than the heroic image later generations tend to remember. The two men genuinely admired each other and genuinely liked each other, the way intelligent and confident people often like each other when they meet someone they're equal. They could sit up drinking and telling stories until midnight, trading literary quotations, laughing at jokes outsiders would never understand. On a personal level, this was a real friendship, a rare thing between wartime national leaders. But on strategy, they argued fiercely and without compromise throughout the entire war. Churchill wanted to strike at the periphery of the German Empire, in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in Italy, in the Balkans, gradually stripping away Germany's allies and occupied territories before striking at the center. This was the strategy of a nation accustomed to indirect, patient imperial warfare, and it was also the strategy of a man trying to preserve as much manpower as possible for a country exhausted after years of fighting alone. Roosevelt and his American generals, especially General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, wanted to strike directly at Western Europe, land in occupied France, and drive straight toward Germany. This was the strategy of a nation with abundant resources that believed the shortest road to victory was the most direct one. In 1942, Churchill won that argument. Roosevelt agreed to the North Africa campaign, called Operation Torch, instead of an immediate landing in France, as Marshall wanted. Allied forces landed in French Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, then fought to push German and Italian forces out of all of North Africa over the following months. Victory in North Africa opened the way for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and then mainland Italy in September 1943. Italy surrendered and switched sides, but German forces immediately occupied all of northern Italy and turned it into a massive war of attrition that the Allies had to fight kilometer by kilometer for nearly 2 more years. Marshall looked at the situation in Italy and told Roosevelt this was exactly what he had feared, a long and costly war on the periphery, while the real enemy remained standing firm at the center. Roosevelt nodded and decided it was time to meet Stalin in person to discuss the war from the viewpoint of all 3 of the Allies' great powers together. The Tehran Conference took place from November 28th to the 1st of December 1943. This was the first time Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met all at once in the same room, forming what the press called the Big Three. Roosevelt had wanted to meet Stalin for a long time. He believed, or at least wanted to believe, that personal relationships carried real weight in international diplomacy, that if he could sit down and speak directly with the man ruling the Soviet Union, he could build the level of trust needed for post-war cooperation. Stalin agreed to meet in Tehran, the capital of Iran, because he did not want to travel far from Moscow while the war against Germany was still at a decisive stage. This was Roosevelt's first concession to Stalin, having to travel further to reach a place Stalin preferred rather than choosing a more neutral location. Roosevelt saw Stalin in person for the first time, and his first impression was one of surprise. He had pictured a frightening, cold man based on what he had read in intelligence reports. Stalin, in reality, was smaller in stature than he had expected, dressed simply in a beige military uniform, spoke little, and observed everything around him with small, still eyes that gave away no clear emotion. Over days of extended sessions, Roosevelt tried to build a personal rapport with Stalin in his own way. He sometimes deliberately teased Churchill with light jokes about the British in front of Stalin, trying to create the sense that he and Stalin stood on the same side. As men who were not old-style European colonial powers, Stalin sometimes smiled at these jokes, but no one ever knew exactly what he was thinking. Churchill sat through this unhappy, but he was wise enough not to show it. The most important decision made at Tehran was confirming that the Allies would open a second front in Western Europe in 1944, landing in occupied France. Stalin had been demanding this for a long time, since the Soviet Union was bearing the burden of fighting German forces alone on the Eastern Front at an unimaginable cost. With millions of Soviet soldiers dead and tens of millions of civilians suffering under German occupation, Roosevelt gave Stalin a clear commitment that the invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord, would take place in May 1944. Churchill still hesitated, wanting to continue the peripheral Mediterranean strategy a while longer. But at Tehran, with Stalin sitting across from him clearly wanting a concrete commitment, Churchill had no choice but to agree. This was the moment Roosevelt used the weight of the US-Soviet relationship to force Churchill to accept the strategy American generals had wanted since early 1942. It was a subtle and effective diplomatic maneuver, though Churchill never entirely forgave Roosevelt for that moment. Returning from Tehran, Roosevelt had to make another important decision: who would command Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy? Most people in the US military assumed the obvious answer was George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, the strategic architect of the entire American war effort, the man who had built the American armed forces from a few 100,000 men to millions in under 3 years. Marshall wanted to command Overlord. He thought it would be the fitting peak of his career. Roosevelt thought about this for a long time. Then he called Marshall in and told him he could not send Marshall to Europe because he could not sleep soundly unless Marshall stayed in Washington. Marshall was too important, too irreplaceable as the coordinator of America's entire military strategy on both fronts, to be pulled away to command a single operation, no matter how large that operation was. The man chosen instead was Dwight David Eisenhower, a general almost no one had heard of before the war. Eisenhower was not a military genius in the mold of Patton or MacArthur, brilliant battlefield commanders with spectacular victories. Eisenhower was a coordinator, a consensus builder, a man who could sit in a room with arrogant British generals and stubborn American generals and get them all working together toward a shared goal without anyone walking out of the room feeling insulted. Roosevelt chose Eisenhower for exactly the reason he did not choose men with more dazzling military talent. The invasion of Normandy was not merely a military operation, but the largest coalition operation in history. requiring a leader who could manage people as much as manage tactics. And in that domain, Eisenhower had no rival. This was a sound judgment on Roosevelt's part. Eisenhower commanded Operation Overlord, the landing at Normandy, on the 6th of June 1944, successfully, and ultimately led the Allies to victory in Europe. In the summer of 1944, Roosevelt decided to run for a fourth term. This decision was less controversial than the third-term decision had been, since everyone now understood that changing leadership in the middle of a war was impractical. But those close to him could plainly see that he was tired in a different and deeper way than in all the previous years combined. He had lost a significant amount of weight. The hollows under his eyes were darker and deeper. His skin had taken on the gray tone of someone anemic. His doctor, Howard Bruin, a cardiologist secretly brought into Roosevelt's personal medical team in early 1944, discovered that Roosevelt's blood pressure had reached a seriously dangerous level, that his heart was failing, and that he was in the early stages of congestive heart failure. Bruin told Roosevelt he needed far more rest, a more disciplined diet, and a lighter workload. Roosevelt listened to this advice, nodded, and went back to working 12 hours a day, exactly as before. One important decision in the 1944 campaign that drew little attention at the time, but later became one of the most significant decisions in 20th century American history, was the replacement of the vice president. Henry Wallace, the sitting vice president, was a progressive idealist, deeply loved by the working class and the left wing of the Democratic Party. He was an enthusiastic advocate of cooperation with the Soviet Union and held foreign policy views many in the party considered naive and dangerous, given how rapidly the world was changing. Senior Democratic Party leaders came to see Roosevelt and told him bluntly that given his state of health, the chance the vice president would have to succeed him before the term ended was quite high, and they did not want Henry Wallace to become president. Roosevelt did not argue with them about his own health. He agreed to reconsider the vice presidency. The man chosen after complicated rounds of backroom negotiation was Harry S. Truman, a senator from Missouri, known for his integrity and pragmatism, but never regarded as a leading national figure. When Truman was informed he would be the vice presidential candidate, he sat silent for a moment, then said he did not want it. He accepted the role because the party asked him to, and no one present in that meeting room that day knew they had just chosen the next president of the United States. Roosevelt and Truman met formally only a handful of times during their time serving together. Roosevelt did not tell Truman about the Manhattan Project, the secret program building the atomic bomb. He did not tell him about the delicate arrangements he was building with Stalin for the post-war period. He did not tell him the true state of his own health. This would later be considered one of Roosevelt's greatest mistakes in his final months, since it left Truman to inherit an extraordinarily complex foreign policy legacy without full information. While these political and diplomatic decisions were being made in closed rooms in Washington, Tehran, and London, millions of people were dying on the battlefields. In the Pacific, American forces were fighting island by island under an island-hopping strategy, striking strategically important islands and bypassing less important ones. Every island was a fierce, bloody battle, since Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, never surrendering, turning every cave and every thicket into a defensive position. In Europe, after D-Day, Allied forces were fighting to push German troops eastward through France and Belgium. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army, after its victory at Stalingrad, was advancing westward at an ever-increasing pace, driving German forces out of Soviet territory and into Eastern Europe. Roosevelt followed all of this through maps updated daily on his desk and through coded phone calls with field commanders. He intervened in tactics far less than people often assume. trusting his generals to make specific military decisions while he focused on the larger strategic picture. But the biggest question Roosevelt was wrestling with in 1944 was not a military one. It was a political and geographic one. What would the post-war world look like, and what role would America play in it? Roosevelt had a clear vision for this, one he called the Four Policemen. His idea was that after the war, the four great powers, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, would together maintain world order, each responsible for its own geographic region. Like four policemen patrolling four different districts of a large city. This idea had serious problems that even Roosevelt acknowledged, including the assumption that the great powers could trust one another and would not clash over their own interests. But it was the best idea he had, and it formed the foundation of the United Nations he was working to establish. In November 1944, Roosevelt won his fourth election by a comfortable margin, though not as overwhelming as in 1936. America voted for him again, not because he had won them over with new ideals or bold programs, but because in wartime, people did not want to change leadership, and because they believed Roosevelt, with all his experience and international relationships, was the only man who could lead America to victory and then build the peace that followed. They were not wrong about that, but they did not know that the man they had just re-elected was racing not only against an enemy abroad, but against time within his own body. The fourth inauguration in January 1945 was the shortest and simplest in modern American history. At Roosevelt's request, the ceremony was held at the White House instead of the Capitol, as tradition dictated, with a minimal guest list and no large reception afterward. He explained that in wartime, it was not fitting to hold lavish, costly ceremonies. Those present that day saw a man who looked years older than at his previous inauguration. His inaugural address, this time, ran under 600 words, the shortest in history, and in it, he spoke of what he had learned from this war, that peace could not come from isolation, that there had to be cooperation among nations to keep the world from falling into war again. He said these things in a voice weary, but still clear and still full of conviction. Then he turned back into the White House to prepare for the longest and most difficult trip of his career. Yalta was waiting for him. Chapter 9. Yalta and the Shadow of What Was Yet to Come. February 1945. The war in Europe was drawing toward its end, but had not ended yet. Allied forces from the West had liberated nearly all of France and were advancing into German territory. The Soviet Red Army from the east was closing on the Oder River, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. Hitler was still there, hiding in the underground bunker beneath the German capital, issuing orders to fight that fewer and fewer people obeyed, since most of what remained of his army was disintegrating. But the war was not over, and the post-war world remained a blank page. Who would write on that page, and what would be written, was the question three men were about to try to answer as they met at an old Tsarist palace on the Crimean Peninsula. The trip to Yalta was the longest and most grueling journey Roosevelt undertook during the entire war. He left Washington aboard the USS Quincy, crossing the Atlantic in winter, then stopped in Malta to meet Churchill before the two flew on to Crimea together. The flight from Malta to Saki Airfield in Crimea took 7 hours, passing over regions that only months earlier had still been an active war zone. Roosevelt sat aboard the plane, a thin blanket over him, sleeping in fits and eating very little. When the plane landed and the door opened, the Soviets waiting on the runway saw a man being carried out in a special chair, unable to walk down the stairs on his own. His face gray and his eyes sunken beneath the winter Crimean sun. Churchill had seen Roosevelt in Malta a few days earlier And in his private diary, he wrote, in a tone that could not hide his worry, that the president looked as though he did not have much longer to live. This was not the poetic assessment of an old friend. It was the cold assessment of an experienced observer. The Yalta Conference took place at Livadia Palace, the former summer residence of the Russian imperial family before the revolution. Stalin chose this location partly for practical reasons, still unwilling to travel far from the Soviet Union, but also partly because this was a region only recently liberated from Nazi occupation, where the marks of war and devastation were still plainly visible. It was an unspoken reminder that the Soviet Union had paid a higher price than anyone else in this war. Roosevelt stayed at Livadia Palace, in the room once reserved for Tsar Nicholas II. Churchill stayed at another palace several kilometers away. Stalin stayed at a Soviet facility outside the city. Formal sessions began on February 4th and lasted 8 days. Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair, wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, trying to appear healthier and more alert than his body truly was. Those present at the sessions later recalled that at times he would suddenly lose his train of thought, his eyes drifting off into the distance and his mouth slightly open, then return to the meeting as though nothing had happened. Dr. Bruin sat at the back of the room, watching him constantly. The matters negotiated at Yalta would shape the world for the next half-century. The first and most important issue was the future of Poland. This was the thorniest question at Yalta, and the one many would later use to judge the entire conference. The Soviet Red Army had liberated Poland from Nazi Germany and now controlled the whole of Polish territory. Stalin wanted Poland's eastern border shifted westward, so the Soviet Union could annex territories he considered historically its own, and in exchange, Poland would receive compensating territory in the west taken from Germany. More important than the border, Stalin wanted Poland's post-war government to be a pro-Soviet government, not the government in exile in London that Britain and America still recognized. Roosevelt and Churchill needed the Soviet Union to enter the war in the Pacific after Germany's surrender, since American generals estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands could cost America 1 to 2 million soldiers if fought alone. Soviet entry into that war could significantly shorten the fighting in the Pacific and save countless lives. This was the most important piece of leverage Stalin held at Yalta. Roosevelt agreed to Stalin's proposals on Poland in exchange for a commitment that the Soviet Union would allow free elections in Poland in the near future and would join the war against Japan after Germany's surrender. He also agreed to let the Soviet Union occupy and control the German and Japanese territories the Red Army would take over, including the northern half of the Korean peninsula down to the 38th parallel, in exchange for Soviet agreement to join the United Nations organization Roosevelt was working to establish. Churchill was unhappy with much of what happened at Yalta, particularly regarding Poland and Eastern Europe. He understood Stalin's true nature far better than Roosevelt did, and understood far better just how much a promise of free elections from Stalin's mouth was actually worth. But British forces on the ground were in no position to change the fact that the Red Army already controlled the whole of Eastern Europe, and Churchill had no choice but to accept what negotiation could not undo. In the evenings at Yalta, Roosevelt often sat alone in his room after the sessions ended, too tired to join the long dinners Stalin hosted and invited him to attend. Dr. Bruin tracked his blood pressure every day and recorded increasingly worrying numbers in his notes. The decisions made at Yalta would later be judged very harshly, especially by Eastern Europeans who lived through decades of Soviet domination after the war. People called Yalta a betrayal, a deal that sold Eastern Europe out to Stalin. People said that Roosevelt, in his declining health, had been manipulated by Stalin and had agreed to things a healthier, more alert president never would have. Those judgments are partly fair and partly not. They are fair in that Roosevelt misjudged whether Stalin would actually keep his promises about free elections. Stalin did not keep them. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and the other Eastern European nations became Soviet satellites in the years after the war, not the independent democracies Yalta had promised. They are unfair in that most of what was agreed at Yalta simply acknowledged the military reality already on the ground. The Red Army was already there. No Western Allied force could or would push them out. Debating whether a healthier Roosevelt could have achieved a different outcome is debating an alternate history that never happened. On the 11th of February 1945, the joint statement of the Yalta Conference was signed. Beyond the questions of Poland and Eastern Europe, the statement confirmed that the Soviet Union would enter the war in the Pacific within 3 months of Germany's surrender, that post-war Germany would be divided into occupation zones, and that a conference to establish the United Nations would be held in San Francisco in April 1945. Roosevelt left Yalta with a feeling he described in a letter to a close friend as cautious satisfaction. He wrote that he believed Stalin could be worked with if treated with respect and as an equal, and that he hoped the United Nations would become the mechanism for resolving future disagreements before they escalated into conflict. Churchill read those remarks and worried in a way he did not voice to Roosevelt. On the 1st of March 1945, Roosevelt reported the results of the Yalta Conference to Congress, and this time, for the first time in 12 years as president, he did not stand behind the podium. He sat in his wheelchair before the representatives and senators and opened his speech by addressing that fact directly. He said he apologized for sitting rather than standing and explained that carrying 10 kilograms of steel on his legs through a long speech was more than he could manage at this point. He said it in a light, matter-of-fact tone, with no hint of seeking sympathy, simply stating a fact. The chamber fell completely silent in that moment. Those present later recalled that this was the first time many of them truly understood that their president was paralyzed, and that this man had hidden it for 12 years while leading the country through the Great Depression and World War II. No one in the room said this out loud that day, but many later admitted they looked at him sitting in his wheelchair and felt something hard to put into words, perhaps a mixture of reverence and pain at realizing this man was nearing the end of his journey. After the speech to Congress, Dr. Bruin strongly recommended that Roosevelt rest. His blood pressure had reached a level that was, medically speaking, extremely dangerous. Bruin told those close to Roosevelt privately that his condition could lead to a stroke or cerebral hemorrhage at any time. Roosevelt decided to go to Warm Springs, where he always felt better, to rest for a few weeks before attending the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco in April. He arrived at Warm Springs on the 30th of March 1945. Spring was beginning in Georgia, dogwood bushes blooming pure white along the red dirt roads he had known for more than 20 years, since he had first come here, seeking the warm springs in hope of healing his legs. During his days at Warm Springs, Roosevelt looked slightly better than when he had left Washington. The Georgia spring air, the quiet of the small roads, and evenings without the phone constantly ringing let him eat and sleep a little better. He sat on the porch in the mornings, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, then did light work with the files his aide brought him each day. He also had a visitor. Lucy Mercer Rutherford, the woman from the affair 27 years earlier, whom Roosevelt had promised Eleanor he would never see again, had come to Warm Springs and was staying at a nearby house during those days. Roosevelt and Lucy had in fact kept up secret contact for years through arrangements made by Roosevelt's daughter Anna, something Eleanor did not know about. Lucy had brought along Elizabeth Shumatov, a Russian-born portrait artist, to paint Roosevelt's portrait as a gift for one of Lucy's relatives. The morning of the 12th of April, 1945, began ordinarily at the Little White House. Roosevelt sat down in an armchair around 11 in the morning for Mrs. Shumatoff to begin sketching his portrait. He wore a gray naval cape and a red tie, his hair neatly combed. Around him were those close to him, Dr. Bruin present in the house, Lucy and Mrs. Shumatoff seated in front of him, aides working in other rooms. He held papers he had been reading, occasionally looking up so Mrs. Shumatoff could study his face, occasionally exchanging light remarks with those present. The mood in the room was quiet and easy. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Roosevelt raised a hand to his temple. He said quietly that he had a terrible headache. Then his head dropped forward. Dr. Bruin rushed into the room. Roosevelt was unconscious, unresponsive. Bruin identified it at once as a severe cerebral hemorrhage. He and the nurses moved Roosevelt to the bed and began emergency medical procedures. But Bruin knew within those first seconds that there was nothing that could be done. At 3:35 in the afternoon, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. He never regained consciousness. The news was kept quiet for several hours while Eleanor was informed in Washington and Harry Truman was summoned to the White House. Truman was having bourbon with congressional leaders in the office of the Speaker of the House when an aide came in and told him he needed to come to the White House immediately. Eleanor met Truman in the White House sitting room and placed a hand on his shoulder. She said, in a voice astonishingly calm, that the president had passed away. Then she asked if there was anything she could do for him. Truman looked at her and said he needed to ask her the same thing, since she was the one who had just lost someone she loved. When the news was announced at 5:47 that evening, April 12th, America stopped. What happened in the hours that followed across America is something no words can fully capture. Soldiers fighting in Europe heard the news over the radio and sat down beside their foxholes, some weeping, some saying nothing at all. Factories halted work. Schools sent children home early. In major cities, people stood on sidewalks, staring at the special newspaper editions just handed out, not speaking to one another. Many of them had never known any other president. Roosevelt had taken office when they were children, and now they were young adults or grown men and women. He was the one constant presence through the most terrifying years of their lives, the voice on the radio during their darkest nights, a man who, even when they did not always agree with him or like him, felt familiar and trustworthy in a way very few people in power ever managed to be. The train carrying Roosevelt's body left Warm Springs on the night of April 12th. All along the route from Georgia to Washington, people stood waiting in the darkness on either side of the tracks to watch the train pass. No one had called them there. There was no announcement. People came on their own, carrying candles or flashlights, standing still in the night as the cars rolled slowly past them. A journalist riding the train recalled that at every small station it passed through, whether it was 2 in the morning or 4, people were still standing there. Farmers, miners, families with children asleep on their parents' shoulders, all standing still in the darkness, watching the train until it disappeared around the bend. 25 days after Roosevelt's death, on the 8th of May, 1945, Nazi Germany signed its unconditional surrender. World War II in Europe was over. The man who had led America and played such a crucial part in that victory did not live to see the day. The war in the Pacific continued for 4 more months, ending in August 1945 after Truman ordered the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the weapon secretly built under Roosevelt's order. A decision on how to use it that he did not live to make. The portrait Mrs. Shumatoff had been painting that afternoon of April 12th was never finished. It became the last portrait ever made of Franklin Roosevelt, frozen at an incomplete moment, part of the face sketched in, part of the canvas still bare white. People left the painting exactly as it was. No one ever finished it. And perhaps that was fitting, because the story of Franklin Roosevelt, like the story of the era he was building, was never truly finished on the day he died. It carried on in the institutions he built, in the agreements he left behind, in the people he trained, and in the ideas he brought into the world. What remained unfinished was not a weakness of his legacy, it was the very nature of it. Chapter 10. Legacy, the Shadow of a Giant. There is an interesting detail about the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial in Washington. When the Architects and Design Committee discussed how to depict Roosevelt in the memorial's main statue, they debated at length over a question that seemed simple but was actually quite complicated. Should Roosevelt be shown sitting in a wheelchair? Roosevelt had been extremely careful throughout his life never to be seen in a wheelchair in public. He guarded his disability like a state secret. But he had been dead for more than 50 years by then, and the world had changed. Organizations representing people with disabilities pushed hard for the statue to reflect historical truth, that the greatest man ever to sit in the Oval Office had carried out that entire historic career from a wheelchair. In the end, the compromise was to add a second statue, placed at the entrance to the memorial, showing Roosevelt sitting openly and unhidden in his wheelchair. Not the central statue, but not hidden away either. It was a small, imperfect compromise, much like most things connected to Roosevelt's legacy. Harry Truman was sworn in as president on the afternoon of the 12th of April, 1945, just hours after Roosevelt's death. He was the first to have to live in the enormous shadow Roosevelt left behind, and he did it as a man fully aware of his own position. Truman told reporters in his very first days in office that he felt as though the sun, the moon, and the stars had all fallen on him at once. This was not pure metaphor. He had just inherited an unfinished world war, an economy in the middle of transitioning from wartime to peacetime, complicated diplomatic commitments from Yalta that he did not fully know, and a secret weapon he did not even know existed until Roosevelt was already dead. The day after taking office, Secretary of War Henry Stimson came to see Truman and told him about the Manhattan Project. That America was building an entirely new kind of bomb, using nuclear fission with destructive power greater than every weapon that had ever existed in human history combined. Roosevelt had signed the order to begin the Manhattan Project in 1942. He had followed its progress through secret reports for 3 years. But he did not live to the day when he would have had to decide whether to use it, and that question now belonged to Truman. In August 1945, Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. World War II ended. Roosevelt's legacy includes that weapon too, even though he was not the one who decided how it would be used. In April 1945, just weeks after Roosevelt's death, the conference to establish the United Nations opened in San Francisco exactly as he had planned. 50 nations signed the United Nations Charter in June 1945. Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman who had been the conscience of her husband's administration for 12 years, continued contributing to the ideals he left behind in her own way. Truman appointed her as the American representative to the UN General Assembly. In that role, she chaired the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, and now one of the most important documents in the history of international law. The woman who had begun her journey as a shy, insecure wife, learning to speak in public under the guidance of a political aide named Lewis Howe, ended her journey as one of the most respected human rights figures in the world. Roosevelt did not do that for her. It was her own circumstances and her own will that did it. But the marriage to Roosevelt, painful and imperfect as it was, placed her in the position from which she was able to do what she did. But not everything Roosevelt built at Yalta and the other wartime conferences unfolded the way he had hoped. Within a few years after the war, the Eastern European nations Stalin had promised free elections became satellite communist states of the Soviet Union. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, all were pulled into the Soviet orbit in ways their own people never chose. The Cold War began and lasted nearly 50 years, dividing the world into two opposing camps and placing humanity under the shadow of nuclear threat. Roosevelt's critics say Yalta paved the way for all of that he trusted Stalin too much, that he conceded too much because his health was failing, and because he wanted so badly to believe in the possibility of international cooperation that he ignored the evidence that Stalin could not be trusted. There is some truth in those criticisms, but real history is never as simple as history looked back on from the future. Roosevelt was handling these situations with incomplete information, under the pressure of an ongoing war, with a failing body, and with no precedent to draw on, since no one had ever been in that position before him. While debates over Yalta and the Cold War continue in university classrooms and history books, the everyday lives of tens of millions of ordinary Americans are still shaped daily by what Roosevelt built in the 1930s. Social Security, as of 2024, pays benefits to more than 67 million Americans, including retired elderly people, disabled people, and their dependents. Total payments each year exceed $1 trillion. It is the largest federal program in American history and the single thing preventing tens of millions of elderly people from falling into poverty every year. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation still protects the deposits of more than 150 million depositors in American banks. Since its founding in 1933, no one has ever lost a single cent of savings insured by the FDIC due to a bank failure. Not one person over 90 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission still oversees the financial markets, guarding against the fraud and excessive speculation that led to the 1929 crash. None of these things are perfect. They do not solve every problem. But they are still there, still functioning, still protecting the American people every day, 90 years after being signed into law by a man sitting in a wheelchair in the Oval Office. Structures built during the WPA years still stand across America, often with no plaque or marker to tell passers-by where they came from. Small bridges on remote state roads, post offices in towns whose names few people remember, schools in working-class neighborhoods in eastern cities, murals in the waiting rooms of old airports. All of it, the work of unemployed laborers whom Roosevelt's government gave jobs during the darkest years. And across America there are small roads in remote forested mountain regions, roads running through pine and oak forests that few people know about. Opened up by CCC boys 80 years ago when they were 18 and 19-year-olds who had never left their hometowns. Sent into the woods to plant trees and build roads on the orders of a paralyzed president trying to save his country. In the more than 70 years since Roosevelt died, American historians have conducted dozens of surveys ranking presidents from greatest to least. The results of those surveys shift from decade to decade, depending on the political views of those surveyed and on the ways American society looks back on its own history. But one thing has never changed in almost all of those surveys. Franklin Roosevelt always ranks among the top 3 greatest presidents, usually just behind Lincoln and Washington, sometimes ranked equal to them. This is remarkable because Roosevelt is a far more controversial figure than most others on that list. He broke the 2-term tradition. He signed the order to intern Japanese Americans. He tried to alter the structure of the Supreme Court in a way many considered a violation of the Constitution's spirit. He hid the true state of his health from the public during the most decisive years of his life. He carried on a decades-long affair, and maintained a secret relationship with Lucy Mercer right up to his final day. There is no excusing any of that, and yet history still places him at the top of the list, and that says something important about how greatness is measured in imperfect leaders. The question historians and political scientists still debate is not whether Roosevelt was great, but in what way he was great and why. One view holds that Roosevelt was great because he saved American capitalism and American democracy at the exact moment both stood on the edge of collapse, and that he did it by understanding, better than most of his contemporaries, that a free market cannot correct itself when it fails on a massive scale, and that government must serve as society's safety net. Another view holds that Roosevelt was great because he kept America on the winning side of the largest war in history, and that the free world we live in today, with all its flaws, exists in part because of the decisions he made between 1940 and 1945. Both views are true, and both are insufficient. What matters, perhaps more than any single achievement, is something Roosevelt proved with his own life, not through words, but through the plain fact of what he did. He proved that a person can lose what others consider the basic prerequisite for leadership, the use of his legs, his health, his physical wholeness, and can still rise up and lead an entire nation through the greatest trials in that nation's history. He proved that paralysis on the outside could coexist with extraordinary strength on the inside. He proved that society's expectations about what a disabled person can do are usually wrong, far more often than they are right. He proved that a politician from the upper class could genuinely understand and care about people outside his own class if life forced him to learn that lesson in a way real and painful enough. And he proved that in a democracy, a leader's voice, the way that leader speaks to the people, carries real power to change reality in ways no policy alone could ever achieve. The Oval Office is still there. The resolute desk, made from the timbers of a 19th century British exploration ship, still stands at the center of that room and has been used by nearly every president since Roosevelt. Every president who has sat behind that desk since, regardless of party, regardless of political view, has carried out his duties in a world Roosevelt had a great hand in shaping. The system of international institutions he built, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, are imperfect and have changed a great deal from his original vision. But they still exist and remain the foundation of the international order the world operates within, even as that world now faces new pressures Roosevelt could never have foreseen. There is a quotation carved into the wall of the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, taken from his first inaugural address in 1933. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." People often quote that line as an eloquent statement of courage in a time of crisis, and it is true in that sense. But the line carries a different meaning when you look at the man who said it. The man who said those words in 1933 was someone who had lost the use of his legs 12 years earlier, who had lived through 2 years lying in bed, not knowing if he would ever stand again, who had relearned from scratch how to move and how to present himself to others, and who had gone on to rebuild his political career while hiding the reality of his condition from an entire nation. He knew what fear was, not from books or speeches, but from mornings waking up and realizing his legs still would not move, from nights lying in the dark of a hospital room with no idea what tomorrow would look like. When he told the whole country that the only thing to fear was fear itself, he was not a man who had never been afraid. He was a man who had been afraid, who had looked that fear straight in the eye, and had decided that fear was not allowed to be the thing that determined what he did next. That is the real lesson of Franklin Roosevelt. Not the New Deal, not World War II, not the laws or the treaties. That Roosevelt's wheelchair is now on display at the Presidential Museum in Hyde Park, not far from the wooden house at Springwood where he was born. It is much smaller than people imagine, not a modern medical wheelchair full of equipment. Just a simple office chair fitted with wheels. A design Roosevelt had custom made because he wanted something lighter and easier to move than the standard wheelchairs of the time. People stand in front of that wheelchair and sometimes do not know what to say. Because the simple, modest object in front of them and the enormous shadow the man who sat in it cast over human history are two things hard to hold together in a single moment. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who could not stand upright but carried an entire nation on his shoulders. The man who sat down to see the world from the vantage point of an ordinary person, and from that vantage point changed the world in ways the men who stood tall before him never could. He was no saint. He was no perfect man. He made mistakes, and some of those mistakes caused real suffering to real people. But he was there at exactly the moments his country needed someone to be there, and he did what could be done within the limits of what he knew and what he had. And sometimes, in the history of nations, that is enough. If you've been with us through this whole journey, from Hyde Park to Warm Springs, from Pearl Harbor to Yalta, thank you sincerely. Stories like this exist because people like you are willing to sit down and listen. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. Do you think Franklin Roosevelt was a great man, or just someone lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time? Your answer might be more interesting than you think. Hit like if history told this way deserves to reach more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories from Shadow Historians. And share this video with a friend, a family member, anyone you think would enjoy sitting down to hear a piece of history told the right way. We'll see you in the next story.